Hello, children, and welcome back to the digital classroom of Vikram Juneja. In my next two videos, that is today's video and the next video, I'm going to deal with a short story, Hearts and Hands, written by a very famous author, O. Henry. This particular video is going to deal with the reading of the text and the explanation of the text. And my next video will deal with the title justification, the theme of the story, and the critical analysis. Hearts and Hands by O. Henry. Introduction. Hearts and Hands was originally published under his pseudonym Sidney Potter in 1902. The story is full of twists and wordplay, as was O. Henry's own life. He was sentenced to serve 5 years in federal prison for embezzlement of $854.08 after fleeing to Honduras, then returning to Austin to be with his sick wife, where he turned himself in. O. Henry was released shortly before this story was published, which makes it unexpected sources of compassion particularly poignant. This story is featured in The Unreliable Narrator. Hearts and Hands reading of the story. At Denver, there was an influx of passengers into the coaches, the eastbound of B&W Express. In one coach, there sat a very pretty young woman, dressed in elegant taste and surrounded by all the luxurious comforts of an experienced traveler. Among the newcomers were two young men, one of handsome presence with a bold, frank countenance and manner, the other a ruffled, glum-faced person, heavily built and roughly dressed. The two were handcuffed together. Hearts and Hands explanation. Like many of O. Henry's short stories, a surprise ending awaits readers of Hearts and Hands. The story is set on a train to Denver. An elegantly attired woman named Miss Fairchild is seated on the train when two men arrive. Now, these two men who have arrived over here, they are the ones who have just arrived into that particular coach. One of the person was a handsome-looking man with a bold, frank appearance and mannerism. And if we talk about the other, he was exactly the opposite. He was a ruffled kind of a person, glum-faced, very sad-faced person. He was a heavily built, stout man, and he was also not dressed properly. He was dressed very, very roughly. And one more feature of these two men entering that particular coach was that they were handcuffed together. As they passed down the aisle of the coach, the only vacant seat offered was a reserved one facing the attractive young woman. Here, the linked couple seated themselves. The young woman's glance fell upon them with a distant, swift disinterest, then with a lovely smile brightening her countenance and a tender pink tinging her rounded cheeks, she held out a little grey-gloved hand. When she spoke, her voice, full, sweet, and deliberate, proclaimed that its owner was accustomed to speak and be heard. As and when these two people, one young man, the other person who was a ruffled up kind of a person, they passed down the aisle of the coach and they wanted to reach out to a vacant seat. The only seat which was vacant was a reserved one. It was the one facing the attractive young woman, Miss Fairchild. Here, the linked couple. Why are they called the linked couple? Because they are handcuffed together. They seated themselves. The young woman actually looked. She had a glance. She just had a very slight look at these two people from a distance, and there was a swift disinterest in her look. Then, with a lovely smile brightening her countenance, her appearance, and tender pink cheeks, round cheeks, she held out her grey gloved hand. She was wearing the grey gloves on her hand, and she spoke with a voice which was very sweet, and she proclaimed and she spoke in a manner as if the other person who was listening was used to listening to her and used to speaking and being heard by Miss Fairchild. It seemed as if these two people, one of the persons sitting over there in front and Miss Fairchild, knew each other very well. Let's read further. Well, Mr. Easton, if you will make me speak first, I suppose I must. Don't you ever recognize old friends when you meet them in the West? The younger man roused himself sharply at the sound of her voice, seemed to struggle with a slight embarrassment, which he threw off instantly and then clasped her fingers with his left hand. It's Miss Fairchild, he said with a smile. I'll ask you to excuse the other hand. It's otherwise engaged just at present. Miss Fairchild raised her hand, and as if she had actually understood and she had come to know that the other person, the persons who was sitting in front of her, one of those people was her old friend by the name Mr. Easton. She said, Mr. Easton, if you could excuse me and make me speak, ask me to speak first, I would speak and ask you a question. If it's a custom in the West that when you meet your old friends in the West, you do not recognize them. The other person was actually shaken by the voice because it seemed quite familiar. Okay, he looked at Miss Easton and felt a little embarrassed. Okay, and then he tried to actually raise his right hand, but his right hand was handcuffed with the left hand of the other passenger. So he actually took up his left hand and he clasped the fingers of Miss Easton with his left hand. And he also reciprocated by showcasing that he knew Miss Fairchild as her old friend. He said with a smile, I will ask you to excuse me for not picking up my right hand to shake hands with you because it's presently engaged. Okay, so that's the kind of excuse which he gave to Miss Fairchild. Let's read further. He slightly raised his right hand, bound at the wrist by the shining bracelet to the left one of his companion. The glad look in the girl's eyes slowly changed to a bewildered horror. The glow faded from her cheeks. Her lips parted in a vague, relaxing distress. Easton, with a little laugh, as if amused, was about to speak again when the other forestalled him. The glum-faced man had been watching the girl's countenance with veiled glances from his keen, shrewd eyes. Now, children, to try and justify that his right hand was actually busy at this point in time, he slightly raised his right hand and bound at the wrist by a shining bracelet to the left one of his companion. So his right hand was handcuffed to the left hand of the other passenger who was sitting by him. The glad look on the face of Miss Fairchild turned into a horrified look. She became frightened. She was shaken. The shiver ran down her spine. She was not expecting this. The glow on her cheeks faded away. She became pale. Her lips parted in vague as if she had bewilderedness and she was confused. And she had some distress at this juncture. Easton, with a little laugh, he tried to amuse, as if amused, was about to speak again when the other forestalled her. Now, the other passenger, whose left hand was handcuffed to the right hand of Mr. Easton, he intervened. Seeing the bewildered look on the face of Miss Fairchild, this particular person was a glum-faced man. He was that fat fellow who was not neatly dressed. He had been watching the girl's appearance with his veiled glances. He was trying to actually stake those glances at that girl, and with his cunning eyes, he was trying to read that girl, Miss Fairchild. You will excuse me for speaking, miss, but I see you are acquainted with the marshal here. If you'll ask him to speak a word for me, when we get to the pen, he will do it, and it will make things easier for me there. He's taking me to Leavenworth prison. It's 7 years for counterfeiting. Oh, said the girl with a deep breath and returning color. So that's what you are doing out here? A marshal? My dear Miss Fairchild, said Easton calmly, I had to do something. Money has a way of taking wings unto itself, and you know, it takes money to keep step with our crowd in Washington. I saw this opening in the West, and, well, a marshalship isn't quite as high a position as that of ambassador, but now this man, the glum-faced man, intervened and spoke. He said, if you could excuse me for speaking in between the two of you, you are friends, and I'm intervening, so he's asking for and begging for pardon. But he says that I feel that I can make out that you are acquainted, you know the marshal here. So he introduced the young man to be a marshal. If you'll ask him to speak a word for me, he also asked for a favor. The glum-faced man who introduced himself to be the prisoner and the young-faced man to be the marshal. The young man who was Mr. Easton to be the marshal. He then spoke to Miss Easton. The glum-faced man spoke to Miss Easton and asked for a favor. He said, if you will ask the marshal to speak a word for me when we get to the prison, he will do it, okay, and it will make the things easier for him. He was being taken, and then he said further, the glum-faced man said further that he was being taken by Mr. Easton, that is the marshal, to Leavenworth prison. And he also told Miss Fairchild that he was going to be put into jail for 7 years for counterfeiting. Okay? And the girl, of course, took a deep breath, and that was a deep breath of a sigh of relief. And that color which had faded away on her cheeks, seeing the handcuffs, returned. She said, so that is what the marshal, Mr. Easton, was doing there. So Mr. Easton calmly spoke, my dear Fairchild, I had to do something, and he introduced himself. He said that he is a marshal and he had to do something. Money has a way of taking its wings, means of course he had to come to the West to earn money. Okay, if he had to step up with the crowd in Washington, he had to have a lot of money, and this was a profession wherein he could actually earn a lot of money. He said he saw the opening in the West, and thus he understood that this position as a marshal over here was as good as of the ambassador in Denver. Children, let's read further. The ambassador, said the girl warmly, doesn't call anymore. He needn't ever have done so. You ought to know that. And so now you are one of these dashing Western heroes, and you ride and shoot and go into all kinds of dangers. That's different from the Washington life. You have been missed from the old crowd. The girl's eyes, fascinated, went back, widening a little to rest upon the glittering handcuffs. Don't you worry about them, miss, said the other man. All marshals handcuff themselves to their prisoners to keep them from getting away. Mr. Easton knows his business. Now the girl was very comfortable with the person, Mr. Easton, and she even praised him that he is one of those dashing Western heroes who ride and shoot and go out into all kinds of dangers. And she even said that's different from the Washington life which he lived earlier. And she even said that you have been missed from the crowd. The girl's eyes were quite fascinated when she was speaking to this man, Mr. Easton, but then they rested upon those glittering handcuffs, and she became a little nervous. To which the other man, the glum-faced man, he asked the lady, Miss Fairchild, not to worry. He said that all marshals handcuff the prisoners to keep them from getting away, and he even praised Mr. Easton for knowing his business. Let's read further. Will we see you again soon in Washington? Asked the girl. Not soon, I think, said Easton. My butterfly days are over, I fear. I love the West, said the girl irrelevantly. Her eyes were shining softly. She looked away out the car window. She began to speak truly and simply without the gloss of style and manner. Mama and I spent the summer in Denver. She went home a week ago because father was slightly ill. I could live and be happy in the West. I think the air here agrees with me. Money isn't everything, but people always misunderstand things and remain stupid. Let's explain further. Now, Miss Fairchild, who was quite comfortable talking to Mr. Easton, she asked Mr. Easton that if she would be able to see him again in Washington, to which Mr. Easton replied in negative. He says not soon, and then he says that his butterfly days are over. He fears. Now, when he says his butterfly days are over, it means he has got the hard days now, the difficult days ahead, and all the days which were the days of enjoyment, of freedom, have come to an end. So the girl at this remarked, and that was quite an irrelevant remark to make at this point in time, when she said that she loved the West. Then she started talking softly, and she started speaking about her family, as to how her mother and she spent the summer in Denver. And after that, her mother had to go back because her father was slightly ill. And she said that she could live and stay happy in the West. And she even said that she's more comfortable. The air over here in the West agrees with her. And she says that money isn't everything, basically, and people who run after money are stupid to actually do so. Say, Mr. Marshall, growled the glum-faced man, this isn't quite fair. I'm needing a drink and haven't had a smoke all day. Haven't you talked long enough? Take me in the smokers now, won't you? I'm half dead for a pipe. The bound travelers rose to their feet, Easton with the same slow smile on his face. I can't deny a petition for tobacco, he said lightly. It's the one friend of the unfortunate. Goodbye, Miss Fairchild. Duty calls, you know. He held out his hand for a farewell. It's too bad you're not going east, she said, reclothing herself with manner and style. But you must go on to Leavenworth, I suppose. After this conversation between Mr. Easton and Miss Fairchild, the glum-faced man who was handcuffed to Mr. Easton, he growled. He said, Mr. Marshall, this is not fair that I need a drink and I've had no smoke the whole day. And then he even said to Mr. Easton that he has had a long talk with the lady, and now the glum-faced man needed to smoke and he should be taken to the smoker room. Okay, and he said that he was desperate to have the pipe, to have the smoke. Now to which Mr. Easton rose to his feet. The bound travelers, both the travelers, Mr. Easton and the glum-faced man, they rose to their feet. And Easton, with the same slow smile on his face, he tells Miss Fairchild that he cannot deny a request for tobacco, he said, and he further said that that is the only friend, tobacco is the only friend of the unfortunate people like the glum-faced men, who smoke and try and relieve themselves of the tensions of their lives. And then he bid goodbye to Miss Fairchild and saying that his duty is calling him, and he held out his hand for a farewell. And Miss Fairchild said those last words to Mr. Easton, that it was that very bad that he would not be going east. She even said, she reclothed herself and she said that he must go to Leavenworth prison, because his duty was to actually take the prisoner to Leavenworth prison. And Mr. Easton replied in affirmative. He said that he must go to Leavenworth prison to actually take the prisoner to that prison and actually put him behind the bars. Let's read further. The two men sidled down the aisle into the smoker. The two passengers in a seat nearby had heard most of the conversation. Said one of them, "That Marshall's a good sort of chap. Some of these Western fellows are all right." "Pretty young to hold an office like that, isn't he?" asked the other. "Young?" exclaimed the first speaker. "Why? Oh, didn't you catch on? Say, did you ever know an officer to handcuff a prisoner to his right hand?" Now, these two men, actually, they settled down the island, they reached the smokers. They left that particular coach and they went down to the smoker room. There were these two passengers who were sitting in the seat behind their seat, Mr. Easton and Mr. That fellow, glum-faced fellow's seat. And one of them praised the marshal for doing a good job of listening to the glum-faced man and acceding to his request. And he also said that some of the Western fellows are very good as far as their duty is concerned, as far as their behavior is concerned. And he even praised Mr. Easton for being so young to hold an office of the marshal. The other man corrected this man by saying that he did not catch the glitch in that, and that glitch was that the officer would not handcuff the prisoner to his right hand. So what we get to understand here is that it was actually the glum-faced man who was the marshal and Mr. Easton was the prisoner. Unlike what Miss Fairchild was thinking, Miss Fairchild thought that the young man, Mr. Easton, was the marshal and the glum-faced man was the prisoner. The glum-faced man had actually acted a prisoner because he did not want to spoil and ruin the image of Mr. Easton and in front of Miss Fairchild, and he did not want Miss Fairchild's expectations to actually go haywire, and he did not want Miss Fairchild to feel low after getting to know the truth. So children, you see how the story unfolds itself at the last stage, where the secret of Mr. Easton being a prisoner is disclosed at the very end. Mr. Easton, who projected himself to be a marshal, was actually the prisoner, and the glum-faced man who projected himself to be a criminal who was being taken to Leavenworth prison for 7 years of counterfeiting was actually the marshal. And this is how the story ends, wherein the secret is revealed at the very end of the story. Students, this was with regard to the reading and the explanation of the story Hearts and Hands, written by O. Henry. In my next video, I am going to deal with the critical analysis, the title justification, and the theme of the story. I'll also give you one extract followed by a few questions in my next video. Till then, goodbye, stay safe and happy. God bless you all.